I guess we're here for the panel. This is a panel of magic and mayhem. Okay, so just back up a little bit. We have the contest still going on. You can type "We Thrive Together" in the chat along with your Wattpad username for a chance to win a pack of 100 Wattpad coins to go towards purchase of anything that Wattpad is offering, like page stories and Wattpad Premium. To get now, since we're going to be thriving together, we are here with some fantastic authors. You just met them in the. I'm sorry. I'm currently missing a screen, and I'm trying to be tech. So just bear with me here a little bit. Here, look who we are. So we're here with Kristen Jack, Vera Niams, Bianca DeCoco, MB Dalto, and Flora Nocturna. They're all fantasy authors, and they're excellent people to know. We're going to get into the essentials of fantasy now, and that means we're going to go with the essentials of world building. Flora, tell me a little bit about world building for fantasy.
Well, world building for fantasy is the one thing that's really super exciting, because you get to obviously build your own world. You create the world the characters live in, the society, the religion, the flora, the fauna, the people, like everything. Basically, you get to play God, which is really cool, but it's also really scary because you're basically on your own and you have to create everything from scratch, and it has to be also logical. Like, it doesn't work just to say, well, it works with magic, because magic also has its laws, which you have to create in the first place, and then you have to stick to those laws until the very end. So I would suggest keep extensive notes, character sheets, and be sure that you know your own world. And also, especially if you write in multiple points of view, keep timelines for the characters, so it doesn't happen to you what happened to me in one of my stories, where I had two characters, Rose and Andor, that's from the Enchanted Spring, that I'm writing dual point of view. And then I realized, oops, there's one day they're off. They're supposed to meet, but I had forgotten that one character was one day advanced, so I had to go back and fix that. So all those things can happen, unfortunately. On the other hand, world building is something that I have found can also be really organic. Like, when you write, you discover your world alongside the characters. Like, as you go, you don't have to have everything fixed from the very beginning, because things can evolve, things can change, and you can always go back and revise. So the first draft doesn't have to be perfect. And something that I have also found to be true not only for fantasy, but especially for fantasy, that the world building is not everything. You need the characters to be relatable. Those characters that populate your world need to be well-rounded, because otherwise the readers, they won't care about your elaborate magical system or whatever if they don't relate to the characters. So work on the characters, work on the world, and then you send your characters on an adventure through that world you created, and the readers will follow along, hopefully.
Okay, what about you, Kristen? How do you go about world building and make sure you don't lose track of your characters?
A lot of the times I use what is commonly called a story Bible, which is like where you kind of keep all your notes and your timelines and everything kind of together. When I do world building, a lot of things I do to make it organic is I kind of focus on like small details, like the common things, like games children play, and like the different foods you might encounter in the fantasy world, or family costumes. That's a big one for me, because it's kind of like, not only does it do its own organic world building, but it also helps you build your characters and kind of like show their family dynamics and their relationships. And it's a really good way to kind of like immerse your reader into your world through the small little minutiae.
Okay. Bianca, you are up. Tell us a little bit about your world building.
Yeah. So I think, you know, one of the things that for me was helpful when I was trying to write was that I think that sometimes like when you're world building, it can feel like it's very overwhelming. Like you have a lot of stuff to come up with and do. And so for me, what I found was helpful for my first fantasy book was actually to focus on a very familiar setting. I actually set my book in New York. And so I didn't have to actually create a different like fantasy world, but I did get to focus my world building on like the magic system and the politics of this magical community that was in New York, which was nice. And so for me, that was like a good like step into world building where I didn't have to feel overwhelmed by coming up with an entire world, but I could focus on bits of world building that I wanted to, and not feel overwhelmed in my first kind of big fantasy writing project.
Okay, Lara.
Well, sorry. Go ahead.
No, fill us in on your techniques.
Well, I'm a hardcore planner. I have notebooks of handwritten notes. I do character sheets. I have world building templates, and I just love using those because it's helpful for me to outline my world prior to starting the story. And I think it's important to have as much information as you have going into the world rather than not having enough, because when you go back to write the story, you kind of have to pause and go back and see, okay, I need to do some research, you know, maybe on like blacksmithing and get some information on that. It just kind of causes a lag in the writing process. So it can be helpful to include that. And, you know, a couple things that I think are really important with world building is like exploring like the history of your fantasy world. You know, it shapes the overall tone of the story. For example, you know, if there are any significant events such as wars or battles that happen in the past, that might shape how characters are acting in the present. And, you know, if you're also looking at something like environment, that also shapes the tone of the story, and it provides insight into other elements of world building, such as transportation, economy, and climate. So, you know, they're all connected.
Okay, well, we're going to go into the second question now and look at some common tropes in fantasy, starting with MB. Can you elaborate a little bit and let me pull you up?
I mean, the tropes in fantasy can be any of the tropes. I mean, you want to talk about, you know, what you could find in a contemporary romance or, you know, a mystery thriller or, you know, pretty anything. You can put those into a fantasy story. I mean, personally, my favorite is enemies to lovers. And what's better than having a villain that, you know, your, you know, protagonist has to go up against only to be like, oops, there's only one bed because there's another one. I mean, and then you have like found family and chosen ones. And these are all, you know, those standard tropes that everyone may roll their eyes at, but can be just such great fodder for a fantasy world. I mean, you have a prophecy, you know, magic, you know, can create, you know, chosen ones and deciding who can save the world, you know, and it's just so much freedom, I believe, in a fantasy story where you don't have to follow like the rules of our world or what people believe the rules of our world are. You create your own rules, you know, go back to the world building and the magic systems and the political systems. I mean, you could have orphans that, you know, lost a sibling and, you know, they found each other on the other side of the war. You know, you can have battles that tear families apart. You can have magic that has, you know, split countries and all these other tropes that, you know, if you like try to throw into a contemporary romance, it doesn't work as well. And that's just, you know, how fantasy works. Like you can create your world to fit these tropes and, you know, it just have it like just be so much more, you know, monumental to your plot line as well. You know, it could pretty much drive your whole story. So not only is it a trope, as one would say, but I mean, it's like your whole theme.
Okay, I think you just took the entire question there. But Lara, Lara, take it away. Let's hear how you handle the tropes.
Well, I agree with MB, and you know that's kind of why I really explore the chosen one trope a lot. Like it really sets up that good versus evil theme that we constantly see in fantasy novels. Like, you know, for example, Harry Potter. Like, this individual does have a lot of power, but we get to see them grow into that role as part of their character development. And then, you know, looking at broken bird characters, it also shows another side we're not used to seeing. You know, heroes are expected to accept their role, but with broken bird characters, they have this trauma, and we get to see these thoughts shift as they understand the consequences of not accepting that role. So it really does tie into character development as well.
Okay, Flora, we're gonna come to you. Let's talk about the common tropes.
Well, in terms of tropes, since I write basically fantasy with romance, so all the romance tropes fall into the books, like enemies to lovers that can be, of course, mixed with chosen one, and like what NB has said. So I also enjoy a lot the I don't know if that's a real trope, but like the human woman falling in love with the immortal pointy-eared guys. Yes, I like elves and fae.
Yes.
But I decided to write mainly from the male point of view, like from the elf point of view, because I find it really interesting to see how the elves that we see as the others would see the humans as others. So basically showing how an elf falls in love with someone who he's not allowed to fall in love because his society thinks that he should not be together with a human. So I find it interesting to dive into that point of view, because we have a lot of stories that show the human woman point of view, be it Mass, Holy Black, all those books where they go to the fae world. But I wanted to show the other side. So that for me is a very interesting concept to explore.
Okay, Kristen, let's get your input on this.
Me and tropes. I adore tropes, and I think that they are super important, not only to know and respect the tropes in your genre, but like having a good understanding of tropes really lets you mess with them and flip them on their heads. Like Chosen One and Fated Hero, you could have a geriatric fated one who like suddenly discovers the Chosen One at 78 years old. Or, you know, the reluctant hero decides to just take the day off and the villain takes over, you know. That's the kind of joy of tropes, is that once you know them back and forth, you can take them and totally flip them on their head.
Okay, well, we're going to move on to the next question, and it's a really important one that a lot of people have been asking about. It's like, how would you make fantasy more inclusive by moving away from Europe-centric fantasy? Where?
Well, I'm one of the few writers on Wattpad who labels themselves as an Asian fantasy author. And what this essentially means is an author who writes fantasy stories that follows a protagonist of Asian descent while incorporating either Asian mythology and folklore or culture. And so when I think of inclusive fantasy, I think of examples like Spin the Dawn by Elizabeth Lim, which incorporates Chinese mythology, and there's like the rich Chinese culture incorporated into the storyline, or Lobizona by Romina Garber, which has Argentine folklore. And this emphasis is on like the non-Western setting. And one way to make fantasy more inclusive is to explore other mythologies around the world, because most fantasy books, you know, when they incorporate mythology, it's focusing more on Greek mythology. We're used to seeing that. But there's all this other interesting lore out there, and we've only begun to tap into that as we see more stories that are inspired by Indian or Chinese mythology and traditional publishing. And another way is to search for books that feature non-Western settings. Like, we can learn from what we read. And so checking out platforms like Melanin NYA or Asian Author Alliance on Twitter, they're great resources for finding diverse works. They either retweet or they have like a book of the month where they highlight diverse works, and offering support to authors who specialize in fantasy stories that take place in non-Western settings. They not only provide you with more insight about different cultures and interpretations, but it also supports the author who might otherwise struggle with being heard. And then another thing is to consider exploring the history of non-Western countries. Historical fantasy in East and Southeast Asian settings is very popular in the media, but we don't really see that as much as we would with Western settings and novels. It's mostly Regency, and it's not that they don't exist, it's just they're often overshadowed by works with Western settings. So essentially we have two roles, and we have the role as the author which includes expanding our point of view beyond Western settings and influences and conducting necessary research to kind of broaden our horizon. And then we have this role as the reader, which is helping to expand the platform of authors of non-Western inspired fantasies, because while authors have their marketing techniques, they still need the reader's help with increasing their reach. So, if you see a non-Western historical fantasy book or just a regular fantasy book on Wattpad, read it, share it with friends and family on social media, and leave a review on Amazon or Goodreads. You might be surprised by how your views change. And if the genre doesn't happen to be your cup of tea, at least you can say that you gave it a shot, and the author will appreciate the support either way. So at the end of the day, it's our choice as authors to decide whether we want to opt for a non-Western fantasy, but we can't do it alone. So that's why we have to seek out sensitivity readers, make sure we do our research, make sure we have our works go through critique partners or beta readers, just to ensure we're not offending a culture either intentionally or unintentionally.
Okay. Well, it's very, very complex topic there. I'm glad for your take on it. We're going to move on to some useful tips and tricks for novice fantasy writers. We're going to go straight to Bianca.
Yeah. So I think two of my biggest tips, I think the first one is, for me, I find just reading a lot of fantasy is just really important to start off with. Just make sure that you're reading a bunch of different stuff, see what you like, see what inspires you, see how other people address their magic systems, their world building, all of their things. And from there, that's something that really helps inspire me to kind of write a new fantasy book or delve into something new. And then the other thing for me that I find that's helpful is just like jotting stuff down when things pop into my head, because there is a lot of world building that happens, and sometimes it's hard to just like sit down and try to do it all at once. So for me, I can just be like taking a shower or walking around somewhere, and like a snippet of dialogue or like an interesting concept about a character's past or like the world will pop into my head, and I always have some place that you can jot it down, because as you like get these like little thoughts, it's important to put them somewhere so you don't forget them later, because you kind of need all these like cool small details to really make your fantasy world shine.
Okay, Kristen, we are going to go to you.
I'm actually going to walk it back to when I was talking about world building and how I have a story Bible. And a story Bible is where you keep all those notes, but it's also it's about the organization of it. Like jotting down notes is great on the fly too. And I definitely will add stuff into my story Bible as I go, but you want, especially if you're writing a very complex fantasy system, you want to make sure that you have all the details of how your magic works, including like if something backfires, like consequences of magic failing. You want all of that worked out kind of ahead of time so that you're not kind of like stuck when you hit a scene. You're like, oh no, what do I do now? And just like being able to pick it up at any time. Like if you have to take a break from writing your novel, then you have your story Bible ready and waiting for you to go back to in case you forget your character's eye color or something like that.
Okay, MB, let's get your take. Do you have a world Bible?
Yeah, I do. And exactly for what Kristen just said, like I keep my character descriptions very minimal because I like people to have their own like mind's eye with characters, but I make sure I need to write down hair color and eye color at the minimum, because they're the two things that I always forget the most, and I will always revert back to, okay, what did I say? The other thing I say is just remember that it's your world. You're creating this, so nothing's set in stone. Yes, world building is good and you got to be consistent, which is where the Bible comes in. But at the same time, you can change the rules. You just have to be consistent when you do it. And, if you have a character that breaks these rules, well, you have to also know why are they being broken. Don't try to fill in plot holes at the same time, though, because you need to make sure that the world that you're creating is also believable, despite it being fantasy. Like, people need to be able to step into your world and become a part of it. So you have to make sure that you're consistent, that there are consequences, and that, you know, rules can be broken, but they also have to make sense when you do it.
Okay, that makes sense. And Vera, let's go back to you.
I agree with what everyone else has said. I definitely recommend building your world from the ground up, because the more solid the foundation is, the easier it'll be to introduce your world to the reader in increments. You don't want to introduce all of it at once, and, you know, having something like a notebook by the side of your bed, because you never know if you're going to get an idea like at 2 a.m. At least you have something there and you can write it down. You know, a lot of good ideas come at the most unexpected moments.
Okay, I think we have some time for some audience questions. Great answers, everyone, and I'm sure that the audience is going to wait to hear your take on. Can you share with us your specific template for world building or character building? Can you? Or
yes, I can. I'm not sure how I can do that. Should I drop a...
They can always follow you on social media, and you can follow up with them, or they can follow you on Wattpad.
Yes, definitely follow me on Wattpad. I'll send an announcement out to the world building templates that I use.
Okay, so that's a great way. Can anyone else share theirs? Anybody want to put their stuff up on Wattpad or social media?
I don't necessarily need to put my stuff up, but I will say that I often use D&D character sheets, Dungeons and Dragons character sheets. Because they have all the slots you kind of need, like know the character's backstory and appearance and skills.
Yeah,
D&D Beyond is also very good for that.
I've actually myself. I've actually built character cards. Those are nice.
Awesome.
Okay, so let's move on to: does the MC and the main character in fantasy have to always be good? Like, can they be evil and not want for the destruction of humankind?
I mean,
Yes.
I'm a huge fan of morally gray characters. I mean, there's, you know, the general good versus
Accessibility shortcuts.
I don't know.
What was that?
Okay, great.
The villain
But no,
character.
I definitely think that, like, you may have a character that starts out and the reader can assume that they're the good guy and, you know, the antagonist is the bad guy. But as you go through a story, you know, I keep saying, you know, you go back to, you know, the Marvel movies and, you know, maybe Thanos was right sometimes, but no one really wants to admit that. But, like, there's always that, like, morally gray area that both your protagonist and antagonist can cross. And so you're kind of looking at a story and you're like, so who's really right and who's really wrong? And it all really depends on which perspective of the story you look at. So there.
Does anybody else? Anybody else? No? Okay, let's move on to the next one. Have you ever created a world based on a work of art or another piece of literature? For example, Dante's Divina Commedia for heaven or hell.
Oh yeah, I've used templates like that a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Going once, going twice.
Yes, I definitely.
Bianca.
Wait, someone was speaking, so I think we
yeah.
cut out. Who was saying? Someone was saying something first.
Sorry, it was me.
Oh, Vera, yeah.
Yes, I definitely have done that. I have a story on Vela right now, and the mythology is taken from the classics of mountains and seas, and it's just a compilation of Chinese mythology, and it's been very difficult just because having to translate the Chinese text and make sure the translations are correct, but it's definitely a lot of fun.
Okay, so I'm back on track. I can actually hear now. So, yeah, weird keyboard magic going on. Okay, is magic necessary to include in fantasy?
No,
Who wants to take
not
this?
at all. I don't think so. I mean, I've definitely, I mean, you can call it low fantasy. You know, you have a world that you create with you know, but it could still have political systems and have like good versus bad wars and no magic whatsoever. My story, Lady Mutiny, was pretty much about an assassin in a fantasy world. And there was no bit of magic in it whatsoever, just because I didn't think there needed to be. I mean, I wanted to create the world. I created the, you know, the political system, you know, and the world itself, but, you know, magic didn't fit into it. And I still consider it a fantasy story, even though it would be considered a low fantasy.
I even think that you could include different fantastical races in a fantasy without necessarily having a magic system in place. Like everything just kind of operates without the need for magic. Like, you know, elves still exist, dwarves still exist, but nobody uses magic. They just use their own ingenuity.
Yeah, I agree. What comes to mind are like wuxia novels. It has a lot of Chinese mysticism, and you know that they're usually low fantasy. So definitely don't have to have magic in your books for it to be fantasy.
Okay, so we're going to move on to the next question. It is, how does one avoid info dumping? This is a big one. While world building, and how much world building is too much?
I think one way to avoid info dumping is just really to, like, at the very beginning, just don't fall into the trap of starting your book off with like 4 big paragraphs describing where we are and what's going, like, you know, everything, you know, that's around the person. The nice thing about like stories that have a character who's not from maybe this world is sometimes that you can, or like a chosen one characters that you can learn along with them. So that's one way of getting around info dumping, is that as your character is learning stuff about the world, the reader is learning about the world. And then you can also assume, I think you have to assume sometimes that your reader is smart. You know, people can like take things from context clues. You don't have to necessarily spell things out right away. And people will pick up on it. I think sometimes we get really excited and we just want to like tell everyone about this world we created. But like, if you kind of pull back a little bit, I think you can do it in a way that people can discover it a little bit more organically. And I think that's helpful. People are smart. People can do it.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else want to weigh in?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I'm a huge proponent of telling the world you created through your character's eyes. Because even though they may be living in it, like you can still get a sense for what's going on through them. And like I said, you don't need to shove it down your reader's throats. Like Bianca said, you know, you got to give your readers some credit that they'll be able to fill in the blanks and figure it out. I mean, you can give some, you know, certain things, like if you're walking up to an elf, or if you're like walking, you know, down a wooded, you know, path, you know, along a sea full of blood, you know, you give these certain things, but at the same time, it's like, you don't need to be like, yes, this sea is bloody because of the war 500 years ago where so-and-so met so-and-so and there was a battle, and you don't need to do that. Like, it can come up in conversation, you know, it can come up casually, you know, in like historical text they may need to look through or something along those lines, but you don't need to shove it down your reader's throat for it to be effective.
Anybody else want to go? Okay, no. Okay, so this is going to be the last question, and this one is for me. So, favorite fantasy author? MB, go.
Sarah J. Maas. And I will die on that hill. I enjoy her writing. I enjoy her stories. She really was one of the authors I've read that to this day, like, her storytelling kind of inspires me to these days, just in the sense of the slow burns and the enemies to lovers and those tropes that we love so much. Yeah, no, I think she definitely is. I will probably still read what she puts out. Just, you know, as trashy as it is.
Okay, Kristen.
I'm gonna go with Diana Wynne Jones, classic author who unfortunately is no longer among the living, but she had some of the best, like, organic world building I've ever seen. Howl's Moving Castle still remains one of my favorite novels that I probably read once a year. And the character is a total curmudgeon for most of the book.
Okay, what about you?
It's a tie between L.K. Madigan. She was born and raised from my hometown. She passed away, unfortunately, about 10 years ago. And then I would say either L.J. Smith or Elizabeth Lim. L.J. Smith, her soulmate principle in her Night World books has like really inspired me to incorporate romance in my books. And I just love the Chinese mythology of Elizabeth Lim's fantasy novels.
Okay, Flora? Favorite fantasy author?
Well, I will have to go with the classic Tolkien because he's still my favorite fantasy author because of his incredible ability to build worlds and languages, and like the way he was able to establish basically what's still considered for a lot standard fantasy. And I must have read the Silmarillion several times. Okay, it took me several times to read the Silmarillion. And I still love his world and his writing. Also, I don't write like him, obviously. Like, I enjoy also math books a lot, but Tolkien will be always my favorite.
Okay, Bianca, we're out of time, so you need to go. Come on. Hit us with it.
I would say my favorite, I really like Scott Lynch, who did like the Liza Lochlamora, like a very good like thieving high fantasy series. And then for like a younger reader, when I was younger, I really liked DJ McHale's Pendragon series. It was like the first time as like a kid that I saw characters like I saw the good guys lose like in like a kid's book, and it was like so powerful to me and very cool worlds. And so those were two of my favorites.
Okay, excellent. All right, well, thank you so much for joining us on this panel. It is way too short, and I would love to talk to you more about fantasy because it's a great love of mine. But that's it for now. The next panel is going to be What the Hell, Avella? It's a frank discussion from different perspectives of what's going on with online publishing. I have been Rodney V. Smith. These are some brilliant authors that you need to go read. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye.
What is Writers Connect?
It's a community of writers helping other writers.
Most of us are Wattpad stars.
And that's the connecting thread.
Thanks for sponsoring us, Wattpad.
But we are writers first. It's what we do.
We write every single day.
Well, some of us do.
So we've decided to hold our own author convention.
We have panels organized by writers with topics we want to talk about.
Genre panels like romance, new adult, and vampires.
Industry panels like serial fiction, the craft of writing,
how to get an agent and keep one.
And we have author meet and greet sessions all online.
We don't just talk about it, we live it.
We're not a panel of experts selling books about how to do things.
We're writers, just like you, and we have experiences to share.
So connect with us. Maybe you learn a thing or two.
We write together, we thrive together.
Writers Connect, November 5th through 6th.